we got a lot of questions from the community talking about and asking how audio has been created for Path of Titans with, environment, dinosaur calls, and everything else. And, we wanted to answer some of the questions that people have been asking. So many people have sent in questions through our email, and we have a bunch of answers with Val here himself. Say hi, Val.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for checking it out.
So, first question we have from Up from the Depths, and he has asked, what influenced you to get into sound design and music composing? And are there any inspirations for the music you've created or plan on creating in the future?
That's always a great question to start with, huh? I'd say what influenced me to get into sound design and composing. The composing came first. I'm 32 years old. I started playing stringed instruments, primarily guitar and bass, when I was about 12, 13, right on the cusp of that. And not too long after getting into that, I really just started getting really curious as to how and why things sounded the way they did. I think that's how a lot of sound designers get started, is you hear things that you really, really enjoy the sound of, and you're like, well, I want to replicate that, or I want to understand that, or I want to just figure out what makes that tick. Really, the curiosity element is what guides a lot of musicians into sound design, and that was definitely the case for me. What influenced me, really, there were just a handful of records, probably around, it was around kind of the mid-late 90s and then some of the early 2000s. It all started with music for me, a lot of the kind of grunge era, Stone Temple Pilots, old Tool, Alice in Chains, that kind of stuff, loving the sounds of those records. And then going into the 2000s, where I would have been at 2000, I was 13 years old. That was right about when I started actually really playing instruments. And then there were just a couple, embarrassingly enough, nu metal records at the time, that there were some that just had some really, really interesting production in them. And even to this day, I still can't quite wrap my head around exactly how certain things were done. And that was what got me on the sound design sort of path, was wanting to get under the lid, under the hood of these sounds and figure out what made them tick and why I liked them, and how I could then incorporate that into what became writing, recording, and then mixing and producing all my own music and stuff like that. So that was really what got me started. And then what kept me in that after that point, going into the mid 2000s, was a lot of video game soundtracks. I mean, my name, Valtiel, for some that recognize that, comes from Silent Hill 3. I'm a huge fan of the Silent Hill soundtracks, and anybody that's familiar with those will definitely hear some of the similarities in some of the work I've posted up until this point. And if you haven't seen that, that's here on our YouTube channel. Probably stick a link down in the description for that, for the work in progress soundtrack video, which was posted a couple months ago. Yeah, so a lot of that, not only the music side of it, but then the sound design component of it as well. Akira Yamaoka, the sound designer slash composer behind all the Silent Hill stuff, kind of famously used a lot of weird esoteric sounds for making monster sounds, things like various different animals. I mean, not too dissimilar to how, when we get into talking about dinosaur sounds, how you go about creating those as well. So a lot of that inspiration was in there too, because it was weird monster sounds that you weren't necessarily used to hearing, not your traditional monster sounds, quote unquote. So that was kind of what kept me going in terms of the sound design trajectory with video games. And then, at that point, I had built a studio in my home, just a home studio setup, nothing crazy fancy or anything, and just dove in to figure out how to make those things happen. And the rest was kind of history for me, I guess. And there was a second part to the question too here, right? Any inspirations for the music you've created and plan on creating in the future? A lot of what I just said speaks to the inspiration of that. A lot of the old, lots of horror things inspire a lot of the sound design stuff that I do and the music that I create. I'm really into the psychology of all that kind of stuff and figuring out how to make things as kind of visceral and disturbing as possible, which can only go so far in a dinosaur game, but it's still definitely applicable to creating a lot of the more visceral components to the sounds and whatnot. And then from a musical standpoint, I'm definitely inspired by a lot of a wide range of stuff, anything from the new agey electronic ambient stuff all the way to, what's going on in modern metal music these days. I love like the Doom soundtrack. For anybody that's not familiar with that, or for those that are, is a great example of how lots of modern metal can inspire soundtrack work in video games and stuff like that. It's a great example, and I've learned a lot from Mick Gordon, the composer behind that, via some of his talks and whatnot. So yeah, I'd say that's a good amount of my inspirations presently and moving forward.
Awesome. We have another question from CRGKTO. And he asks, hello, everyone. First of all, incredible job, Valtiel. I love every single sound and track of this game. My question is, how much time do you spend for, let's say, the Latin broadcast? And what software do you use?
Good question. Well, the latter. I use Logic Pro primarily, and then lots of VSTs and plugins and stuff. I like a lot of sample libraries from IK Multimedia, Spectrasonics. Boom Audio makes a lot of great, they make a few great animal libraries that I use for animal sounds, which we'll get to in a little bit when we talk about the Dino Calls a little bit more. And they also have a good creature library, which is probably the only sorts of sounds that I use that would be considered kind of prefab sounds that are already mixed to sound like monster kind of creature elements. But I use those as supplements along with the animal sounds, which I'll speak to a little bit more a little bit later on. And then the Latin broadcast, when I work on an individual dinosaur sound, I've initially been working on getting the main 3 core sounds for the dinosaurs done that are really the identifying sort of character of the dinosaur, your aggressive and your broadcast and your friendly calls. So the broadcast, would be one of those 3. And if I kind of lump that in to say that those 3 calls take me a couple days, I would say the broadcast probably takes me a day or 2. Because a lot of it is trial and error and really kind of trying something, and I could go down the path of something for 3-4 hours and then just find out this really just isn't working. I need to either scrap this one part of it or scrap the whole thing and start over. So that's why it can sometimes take a day or 2. Other times they might come together in just a few hours. The more I've been working on them and the more I've kind of learned my way around, what works and what doesn't work in the context of making specifically dinosaur calls, they tend to go a little bit faster. But yeah, initially I would say anywhere from a few hours to a day or 2 for an individual call, and then a small set of calls per dinosaur.
Yeah, and I also know that sometimes when we're looking at the calls and listening to what you've done, we might think this call is nice, but it doesn't quite suit this particular dinosaur that we were actually going for this time around. So sometimes what we do is this is good, let's put it to the side, we can maybe use it for a future dinosaur because maybe it's a little too heavy for this small dinosaur or whatever. So it never usually just gets chucked away, like we always just save it for the future kind of thing for most of these.
Yeah, because I'm not going to get them all perfect, the first time. There's always going to be a revision sort of step in there. And Jiggy and I will talk back and forth. And yeah, she'll have said to me, like, this one is great, this works, but this is a little too much this, or this isn't quite enough that. And then either go back to the drawing board, start over, or make little tweaks and stuff like that. It's all, part of the iterative creative process.
And it's all difficult because there's not really any real dinosaurs around today to actually base it off. You kind of have to make it up as you go. There's a lot of good examples of, documentaries and movies and stuff, but you don't want to just copy what they've got, right? You want to make something unique.
Absolutely. And it is funny because we will inevitably see that, and we have seen that, people talking about referencing real dinosaur calls. Everything that you've ever heard with regards to a dinosaur call has been made up by somebody. We have very, very little information as to how anything really sounded. We have contemporary examples like, the alligators and crocodiles that we've talked about, which are used a lot in dinosaur calls because they're basically just modern day dinosaurs. But when it comes to some of the other guys, it's guesswork at best, So, and we just base off of, there are kind of established precedents for things like for the big, dinosaurs like your T-Rexes and your Raptors and your Stegosaurus and your Brontosaurus. We've sort of culturally come to a conclusion as to what we think they sound like, and you kind of work off of that, because if you don't work off of that, everybody, will kind of feel that like this doesn't feel right. But at the same time, there's so much creative license that you can take, for your own interpretation about what this might sound like, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah. All right, next question from Tundra Hunter. Will there be a main theme to represent Path of Titans, as in an iconic melody that may also be used in different tracks? And are we focusing only on tribal music, or will there be other genres as well?
There absolutely will be a main theme. I've been working on a couple little things. Actually, Jiggy and I literally just went back and forth yesterday about this. The main menu theme for the game, whether or not that ends up being the main theme to represent the game, or just the main menu theme that's for that, probably yet to be determined. But there absolutely will be our interpretation of a main Path of Titans theme, and that will, as Tundra Hunter pointed out, include elements of tribal music. But there will be definitely, tribal's a kind of I don't want to say a safe fallback, because that makes it sound like a cop-out, but it's a very appropriate thing to use for a dinosaur game. And but there will definitely be other elements as well. There'll be orchestral elements. There'll be lots of kind of ambient, sort of droning kind of atmospheric elements as well, because music in a big sandbox MMO can be a little bit tricky. It's not a linear experience that you can design music around. So the music you do put in there can't be terribly obtrusive, unless it's event-based or something like that. So it will be a lot of kind of just nice background, easy listening things in terms of the background ambience of the game. And then there'll be some more pointed stuff, for big themes, or like I said, event-based stuff, whether it's combat related or quest related, or when you die, in the game, things like that. So there'll definitely be a number of elements. Tribal music will definitely be one of them, but yeah, a lot of that kind of ambient electronic influence. Trying to keep it organic sounding, though. I don't want to go to the direction of it being ambient electronic that sounds, like Blade Runner or something like that. And potentially other elements as well that I haven't come up with yet, because there's a lot of experimentation involved with this, and there could very easily be some things that I could never guess right now once you kind of set down that path of creating music for the game. So we'll see.
So we have another question from Millie. How did you come up with the idea for the soundtrack, and has there been any certain inspiration for it?
Oh, okay. I would say, kind of building on the what I said previously, the inspiration would definitely have been kind of feeling like, what would I like to hear in this environment, combined with what I mentioned about music and sandbox style MMO games being a little bit tricky because it can't be super, intrusive, and it needs to be able to kind of float in and out and blend as you're moving around the world. So I would say some of the I was definitely inspired by the main theme that people have heard up until this point that's in a lot of our videos. There were a lot of great sort of djembe and frame drum kind of loops and samples that I was using from an old Sony sample library that I had arranged into some rhythmic pieces in there. That was kind of the initial, probably what Tundra Hunter was talking about with the tribal music, because that feels very much like that. I would say that was kind of the beginning inspiration for a lot of this stuff, and then working from there, working in the kind of ambient elements that I spoke of previously there, because that's just what feels appropriate for this type of game. But then other inspirations, like that's what I have up until now, and I could be inspired by something tomorrow, and I can be inspired by something 6 months from now that could end up in there that I haven't foreseen yet. But overall, I would say it's just the kind of feeling out what feels appropriate for a game like this. You're not going to really have electric guitars or something like that doing traditional electric guitar things in a dinosaur game like this, unless they're heavily disguised or something.
I know, at least I've been helping a little bit with like the general audio direction that we've been wanting to go for. And there's very certain things, like we didn't want any choir or human voices in the soundtrack at all, because that kind of takes you out of it if you're trying to play as a dinosaur and suddenly you hear a man or woman singing. Like, it's kind of a bit out of there. There's just a few things like that. And you try and incorporate tribal sounds where you can have drums, woodwinds, stuff like that, just to try and keep it feeling primitive. Not necessarily, tribal in that sense, but more like primitive
Just old.
and old. Yeah, that was kind of what we were going for a lot of the sounds. Like you mentioned, though, there will be more orchestral and things and stuff as well mingled in with there, just so it's not the same the whole time. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and that gets a little tricky too with incorporating human elements. I mean, a person playing a drum or a person blowing into a woodwind instrument, there becomes a kind of a human element to that that you have to be careful of, that you don't use too much of, because then it can kind of start feeling like the choir you mentioned, where it's like, oh, this is starting to feel too much like a human being playing this thing, and that, for a lot of people, they might not mind that at all. But for that kind of vibe of really trying to keep as much of the human element out of something that is inherently created by humans, a little bit difficult. But yeah, having woodwind instruments and those things really as ambient elements, and less like this song is a solo flute piece kind of thing,
Yeah.
Definitely the goal there.
All right, well, moving on to dinosaur calls. A lot of people have questions about how you've made them, what you used to make them, etc. So we have someone, Rook Rabbit, asking, what are your favorite inspirations for calls? Where do you look for your inspiration?
That's a really interesting question, because that's kind of one part creative and one part technical. Because in one sense, there's the creative element. Like, I remember, Jiggy, you showed me from way back, what was that? The T-Rex busting through the window, the big roar from that old dinosaur game. Is that Dino Crisis?
Dino Crisis, Dino Hunter. There's a bunch of these older ones where they have the CD compression on the audio quality and stuff like that.
But it was interesting because it definitely, by modern standards, it would be considered to be fairly low quality, but the same energy came across, and the same sort of feeling came across, which is, this is big and dangerous, and scary. And really, it was just kind of a wall of distortion. And it wouldn't be something that I would use necessarily for the core of a call these days, but that is an element that you can use. And that became the inspiration for, I think, when I was working on, I think it's a call that's actually been shelved right now. It's something that we're not using yet, but we're going to plan on using for a future Dino, in layering in just a big wall of distorted, kind of aggressive low end that's not too muddy, just to give it a wall of sound kind of vibe. And that, I got inspiration from that. It doesn't sound anything like, that particular Dino call that you mentioned, but it was inspiration of, if I just use a layer of a big wall of distortion. And I would do that by, maybe taking an alligator call that doesn't have a lot of volume or pitch fluctuation to it, that's pretty steady. And then I might just, using plugins in Logic. Decapitator by Sound Toys is one of my favorite plugins for doing this. For any of you sound design people out there, just use that to just distort the crap out of it and just make it a big aggressive wall of something to layer into the call, to give it that energy, while using the other elements that I will speak to in the next couple questions here, to kind of flesh out the character, the actual animal character of the call. Other inspirations might just be, a absolutely perfect example of an inspiration that actually Jiggy had was listening to those goofy ravens out there in Australia and the calls that they make. And she just heard that and thought that would be a really cool kind of basis to work off of a call for. And then using a bit of that kind of animal sound layered in with other things, but also using the cadence of it. That was an inspiration as well. And then other times you'll just hear a particularly good lion roar or a really good elephant call or something like that when you're, shopping around for animal sound libraries to be able to record. I recorded here at my home. There's a particularly loud frog in my backyard. It's been here for about a week now. And I've caught some really good recordings of him or her. I haven't seen him. That I plan on using for something in the future, dinosaur related. Because you can take something as little as a frog call and time stretch it and pitch it down and distort it and combine it with other things to create something that you would have never guessed started as a frog. And that's kind of the basis for, when you hear me talk about some of the animals I've used for other dino calls, you would wonder, how the heck did you make a cat hissing sound turn into a dino call? And it's all sorts of sound design, manipulation and whatnot, which would be a perfect segue for the next question.
Yeah, next question. So this is from Sebastian Sanchez. Regarding dinosaur calls, what are some of them inspired by? And he is especially curious about the Concavenator's call, as he was one of the people who donated to make that a reality in the game.
Oh, he was. Oh, well, thank you so much, Sebastian, for your generosity there. I hope you really like those calls. Yeah, the inspiration, lots of times what will happen is Jiggy and I will sit down and when we're doing dinosaurs of our own, or obviously when someone who's generously supported us, who has requested a certain dino to be in the game, sometimes they will submit the animals that they would like the call to be based on. The inspiration normally tends to be finding the sound in there, finding the animal sound that you feel like everything else can support. Almost every dino call has one or two core animal sounds in it that are stronger than the others, that are more highlighted or more leaned upon, and then other sounds will be used to reinforce that sound to make it bigger. In the case of the Concavenator, that was that one had about as many sounds as I would normally ever use in a dino call. There were two different types of snake sounds from a cobra and a viper, because in particular, a cobra or a snake, a stereotypical snake hissing sound can be really good for getting that top end clarity that you could blend into another animal. And then there are other snake sounds that can actually be pretty guttural. An example, we're going to talk about cassowaries too in the future. There are some animals that make some very, very unexpected sounds. And I believe it was the viper sound in that case had actually quite a lot of low end weight and body to it. And then mixed in with there, I went into that one planning on using snake and cat sounds primarily, and using an actual just domestic house cat hissing sound along with some sounds from a leopard. Those were the things that kind of filled out, the leopard in particular, I think was what filled out more the kind of body of the sound. Because generally I go into every sound looking to try to get top end clarity, mid-range body, and then however much low end sort of girth is appropriate for the size of the dinosaur. Some of the little guys, you're going to hardly have any of that, if any at all. But then some of the bigger dinos, you really want to lean on. This one's going to be more about the low and mid-range and less about the high-end clarity, and then the smaller dinosaurs kind of tilting in the other direction. And then based on whichever tilt you need, based on the size of the dinosaur, I would kind of select my animal sounds appropriately, for that. And in this case with the Concavenator, it was a matter of finding more of the top-end clarity, which is why there's cat hissing, snake hissing, and there's a hawk. I think it was I can't remember what kind of hawk it was, but there was a hawk in there as well. So lots of top end clarity going on with that one.
Awesome. We have another one from both Mad and Melanie Fan, and they asked, what did you use to make the Spinosaurus calls?
That's an example of one I remember when you first showed me when I first saw the model for it, as well as the kind of physical breakdown of the dino. I thought this thing is just really sharp and pointy and scary looking, and he should be appropriately sharp and pointy and scary sounding. I remember actually really looking forward to doing that one. That was a matter of much bigger dino, so I wanted to find something that really represented the body and the size of that as to be the primary sound, which was what came from both elephant and alligator sounds in that one. And then for the top end clarity, I actually used something similar that I did with the previous one, with the Concavenator, with the cobra hissing. And then I had a barn owl screech in there as well, just to give it a little bit of, I think, kind of mid-range clarity in there. Because again, when you're leaning on big elephant, big alligator sound, you oftentimes, for me anyway, I like to have something poking through there a little bit. So there's a barn owl that I'm pretty sure was stretched and pitched down and kind of fitted into the gaps that were left behind after the cobra hissing made up some of the top end component, and the elephant, the gator sound made up the bottom end of that. Yeah, that one in particular I really enjoyed.
Awesome. And Alex Gibb is asking, what are the possibilities of using cassowary calls for one of the dinosaurs? I feel like the cassowary has a very distinct dinosaur-like call that would fit well on a carnivore.
I agree, definitely. And we did actually use a little bit of a cassowary element in a dino already, although it was a very small element that wasn't, super indicative of a cassowary. That was the Deinonychus. And I think it was used, I'm looking at my session here, I believe it was used in the friendly call, actually, for that one. Either the friendly call or the alert call, but something fairly short. And yeah, I would absolutely love to use that for a future one, for a future dinosaur, rather. And I actually have in this session some calls that I had, now that I'm looking at it, earmarked to use in the future because they felt like they were appropriate for something, but not for this particular dino. So yeah, absolutely plan on using those.
Anon Max and Rook Rabbit have both asked, which call was the hardest to figure out and which call was the easiest?
There were definitely a couple in there that were really difficult for me to figure out.
I remember
Maybe not
the Latin being a tough one.
Yes, yeah, it was between the Latin and the Latin in particular. That would definitely probably be the toughest one because we had some inspiration for animal sounds that we wanted to use for it, and they kind of just proved, as much as we wanted to use them, they proved to be really difficult to integrate. When you're combining animal sounds together, as you can imagine, it's really easy for it to become a mess if you're not careful, and it's really easy for certain sounds to just not work well together, not complement each other well, and no matter how much you try to smash them together, it's just not working. So I would definitely say the Latin was probably the most difficult. And took the longest for sure. I mean, sometimes when I get stuck on something like that and I'm not happy with how it's coming out, it can start to take days, maybe even a week of dedicated time to really get to the core of it. That's definitely an outlier. But that was, the smaller dinos can be really difficult because the bigger ones, big sounds are easy. You've got lots of big animal sounds that you can use. But the little guys, it can become really difficult to, I don't want to say disguise, but there's only so much you can do. There's only so much you can hide behind in terms of size. You can make things big and loud and mean and imposing. Just like, for musicians out there, a good example would be for any drummers, it's really easy to conjure up loudness and excitement and energy from drums, and it can be really, really difficult in a musical context to conjure up something soft or delicate or gentle. And that's kind of how it is with the dinosaur sounds. These little guys, you want them to sound fierce sometimes, for the more aggressive ones in particular, but it can be really difficult to find the right kind of sounds to make that happen without leaning on the crutch of having big animals with the power behind them to kind of save you a little bit. So, and if on that note, I would say the Spinosaurus was probably one of the easiest. And going back initially, the which one? I think the Stegosaurus too was fairly straightforward. Like I just said, the biggest guys tend to be the easiest. They can be a little bit more difficult from a mixing standpoint. Like sometimes they can get really muddy or indistinct. I know Jiggy and I have gone back and forth on that. She's always really wanted all the sounds to really have their own really identifiable character. And sometimes when you make big and loud too many times, you can just have three different dinosaurs that are just three slightly different flavors of big and loud, and the kind of individuality gets lost. So they can be a little bit more technically challenging, but technically challenging I'll take 10 out of 10 times over creatively challenging for sure.
All right, we have another question from Millie. What are the plans concerning environmental sounds? Are you planning on adding particular sounds that you deem fitting for the roaming times of the dinosaurs, like certain species of birds or small flyers, etc.? And if so, what would they sound like?
That's a good question, actually, and that's been a topic of conversation between you and I about what we felt like was appropriate for the environment sounds. We wanted to try and strip out as much. Well, first off, we wanted to make sure that there was nothing that could be considered prehistorically inaccurate in the environment sounds. I remember in particular, Jiggy, you had pointed out like red-winged blackbirds as having such a distinctive sounding call that might pop up in an audio recording of the outdoors that can't be there, because that's very distinctively, a modern bird, so to speak. And same thing, with I've recorded some of my own outdoor ambience as well as used some stuff from Boom Audio. They have some great outdoor environmental recordings that are taken, likely in parts of the world that I don't have access to. So stripping out the elements of those recordings to make sure they don't have anything I mean, insects and things like that can be okay, because certainly there's prehistoric precedent for all sorts of different forms of insect life. But yeah, having bird calls, I've spent days combing through environmental recordings, just editing out bird calls, because we wanted to actually make sure that we didn't have any in the environmental sounds, not only because of the accuracy purposes that I just mentioned, but also because, in the future, should we want to and plan on doing potentially integrating anything that could take up that space of audio, whether that be a flying dinosaur or whether that be something that sounds similar. You don't want anything sounding similar in your background audio that also exists in the world, because that would be confusing. You don't want to be hearing stuff that you would be hearing coming from another player that's just playing in your background ambience. So generally speaking, I just try and lean on having outdoor recordings that are appropriate for the environment, whether it be open plains or a densely packed forest, whether that be like a redwood forest that's going to have your foliage mostly up top, way up high, or kind of more of a deciduous forest where you have leaves and rustling sounds in trees that are much closer to the ground. Using environmental recordings that are appropriate for that. And then layering in, for weather and stuff like that, layering in storm sounds, layering in wind and rain and lightning and thunder. Well, I guess you wouldn't have lightning in your audio, but thunder, and those sorts of elements. And then just trying to keep them, as neutral and as pleasing sounding as possible, because it's an omnipresent sound in the game. And if it's fatiguing at all, or if it's tough to listen to, or if it's irritating, that's a really bad thing to have for something that you're going to force people to listen to all the time. So using EQ and stuff like that to balance that out.
Another one was that we tried to avoid having any either both high-pitched or low-pitched like sounds that take up the bottom half of the audio spectrum, because you don't want people not being able to hear footstep sounds. That was really important, if you remember that.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a really good point. During certain types of sounds, like when it's stormy and windy and stuff like that, you will have a low-end component, and it makes sense that you wouldn't be able to necessarily hear things in that spectrum during those sorts of weather events. But absolutely, for your normal weather, you have the most identifiable components of the calls and the footsteps. Footsteps, the most identifiable components are going to be upper mid-range, the actual articulate sound of dinosaur foot hitting ground, whether it's grass or water or something along those lines. And that kind of exists in that upper mid-range realm that's fatiguing to listen to for a long period of time, which is why I will tend to EQ that out of the environment sound, but important to be able to hear if it's coming from another player, which works out perfectly. That way it can slot right there into that part that I've cut out of the environmental audio. And then same thing for the low end. You got a big dinosaur that really has some sub, bass thumping sounds. You don't want anything in your environmental audio that's taking up that kind of space, unless it's appropriate to do so, like with the storms and whatnot. So yeah, we've definitely paid attention to that in the creation of the sounds, and then we'll absolutely continue sort of refining that idea when it comes to implementation.
Awesome. And the last question that I'll answer is by Ty Anderson, and they've asked, will it be possible to make mods or change and add dinosaur calls? And the answer to that one is yes, absolutely. we'll be having it's easy enough to import your own sounds into the game and stick them onto your own animations if you're making your own dinosaurs, or environmental sounds, like if you're making, let's say, a desert map or a swamp map and you want a specific kind of ambience to go along with that. That's easy enough. That can go into your map making or something like that. And for the dinosaur calls where you might want to change a dinosaur call, all of the audio files are there, and if you wanted to, export one of our current dinosaur calls and pitch it up or pitch it down or add a different, layer of audio somehow to it, or distort it, then you're absolutely free to, and then you can place it over top our dinosaur calls if you wanted to swap them out with something. So it's all modular. You can do what you're interested in, and there's not really any limitations to it. So.
And that's actually why we were initially planning on using, for all the audio integration, a program called Wise, which is an audio middleware program, and it handles almost everything in terms of audio integration and mixing and layering and blending and fading and all that kind of distance sort of fade or distance occlusion and various different forms of mimicking things in the environment in terms of reflectivity and all that kind of stuff. And then we realized, oh shoot, that's not going to be very modding friendly though, because it would require people to A, have Wise, and B, know how to use it. So we intentionally went for a much simpler approach there by just integrating the sounds directly into the UE4 engine. That way, it's much, much lower barrier to entry for you to be able to go in there, modify things, swap things out, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all the questions we have for now. In the future, if you guys have more questions, we can absolutely answer them if you send them to our email. And yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and thank you, Val, for taking the time to answer them. I really appreciate it, and I'm
absolutely.
sure they do too.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody that submitted these questions. These were fantastic. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.